Smash! Space Marines.
Hey, today we've got another episode of the Marine Painting and Kitbashing series, though I would argue this episode is more of a conversion video. For this episode, I decided to do 3 Emperor's Children successors, though in a lot of ways this is mostly just 3 different ways to paint Emperor's Children. Reason I picked these guys is we did Iron Hands in the last video, so I figured doing their rivals would make sense. Now, I do say conversion, but there is some kitbashing involved. However, the main ingredient that we'll be using to make these guys into Emperor's Children is the old resin kit. This kit is a little dated to say the least.
I'm Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren, bring me the girl. I get a kiss.
But that isn't to say that they're useless. I still like these kits a lot despite how much of a pain in the ass they are to work with. I'm still not super used to trimming mold lines when it comes to resin, as I don't want to break it because it's really delicate. But at the end of the day, and at the end of this video, I was left with 3 really cool looking figures. But before we get into everything, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like what you see, share it with a friend, and if you really dig it, consider becoming a channel member. Get some extra goodies, get to see my content early, and it just really supports the channel. I just want to say a huge thank you to my channel members. You guys are amazing. But enough flapping of the gums, here's the paint list. Something I'd like to mention is a lot of the metallic colors are shared equally between the 3 Marines. Their main armor colors are obviously very different from one another, but when it comes to the metallics, I probably want to spice it up a little bit more. This is kind of my weird way of saying that next week's video will be kind of a sequel to this one. Our first scheme is the Flawless Host. So for the lore heads, I know, technically these guys are not a successor of the Emperor's Children. In previous editions they were, but in their current state they are technically a renegade chapter, formerly known as the Shining Blades. They also just happen to fall into the grasp of Slaanesh. But this kind of ties into why this video is a little bit difficult to pick out the color schemes. When it comes to Emperor's Children warbands, almost all of them have the exact same color scheme or just no pictures at all. So these guys are the perfect candidates. And everybody I know that talks about these guys loves them. So to start actually kitbashing this guy, I took an old Chaos Marine body and I just very viciously snipped away at the torso. I want to snip it very flat and sand it down very nicely and smoothly, as I don't want any jagged edges. Something I had to remind myself while using this kit is resin doesn't work with Tamiya. So I ended up having to use super glue, and I don't have the luxury of just melting the bits together. I really wanted to have a flat surface to adhere this body to. But thankfully, once it's sanded down, it's kind of a perfect fit. Admittedly, it's a little skinnier than most of the mainline torsos we have now, but personally I think this works really well for a Slaaneshi Marine. The more slim profile and silhouette kind of plays into their characteristics. For the Marines' weapons, I used a modern set of a bolt pistol and chainsword, just for simplicity's sake. But for the pauldrons, I ended up using an old Slaaneshi pauldron from the older Chaos Marine kit, which again, for the 15 millionth time, man, I miss that old kit. I really do like that they had just a little bit of flavor for each god. For his melon, I decided to use this very corrupted Raptor's helmet. I really like this one. The horns just kind of scream Slaanesh to me. I love the death mask. It's just kind of perfect for the guy that I'm going for. For the pauldron on the left side, I ended up just using a basic one from the same kit. I would have used a more modern one, but I felt like with the size of the Slaaneshi pauldron, it would have fit a little bit better. I wanted to use the power sword from the original resin kit, but I legitimately felt it was a little too grody to add onto any of these figures. And for the final piece, I ended up using the backpack. This looks a little nasty by today's standards, but once it was painted, I'm pretty happy with it. But with our guy all built, I think it's time we get into the painting. To base coat his armor, I used a 50-50 mix of dark ivory mixed with dark warm flesh and pro-acryl. Now, I want to use this as our main color scheme for most of the armor. The torso is much more of a fleshy texture, so I ended up using a different color for that, but we'll get into that momentarily. Now, you could be arguing that, hey, they already have a flesh-colored scheme, but I felt like deviating a little bit just to mix it up a little bit would look better. Once you've applied 2 thin coats, You can then base coat the bottom half using dark purple mixed with a little bit of dark plum. I wanted to add just a little bit of that reddish color from the plum just to make it look a little bit more in line with the art style of the old scheme. Sometimes these guys are depicted with much more of a cooler purple, and kind of a cooler colored skin for that matter. I just prefer more of a warmer style to these Marines. If you wanted to base coat it using just dark purple, you could go for that as well. Now when it comes to painting the flames, I kind of suck at this, admittedly. As you can see, I'm kind of sketching my flames in, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you mess up. Thankfully, the Dark Ivory and Dark Worm Flesh mix is really good at covering over these spots, so if you need to just go back in and redo it, that's totally fine. Don't be afraid to do that. To paint his flesh, I'd start out by mixing a little bit of Dark Worm Flesh with some magenta. I usually just take a little glob of magenta and then glide over my Dark Worm Flesh, and this really makes it easy to just create some interesting skin tones. A little bit more red works better for Emperor's Children and demon-like characters, so just up the ratio to whatever you please. You're essentially just kind of creating a flowing base coat for this. While cleaning up with the Dark Worm Flesh mixture, I would add this also into some of the areas that I neglected to paint earlier, mainly portions of the Slaneshi Pauldron, and I would also add kind of a thin extra coat to the main areas just to strengthen the color. I'll also be using the same color to add onto the horns of the face. I'm just painting this onto the raised surfaces, the cheekbones, all that. Next, we'll begin highlighting the purple using a mixture of our plum and dark purple with a little bit of white, just the tiniest bit. This allows us to basically use the exact same color, just a little bit lighter. Which, yeah, kind of obvious, I don't know why I explained it like that. But as you can see, I want to be very careful adding this on. I typically like to do my little scritchy scratchies, but I feel like doing this a little bit cleaner on the purple makes it look a little bit better. After all, their entire gimmick is that they like being perfect. Though if you wish to add in the scratches, I'm sure it would look cool regardless. Next, we'll be shading the purple using a very, very concentrated shade into the recesses using a little bit of Druchii Violet. Now you're probably wondering why I highlighted first and then did a little bit of shading. I find that it's easier to shade when you have more of a definite area that is highlighted. It's kind of like coloring within the lines for me. I want a Warhammer coloring book. Next, to shade the skin-like portions of the power armor, I'd use Carroburg Crimson mixed heavily with Lamian Medium. I am definitely curious to try this with several different glazes of different flesh tones and whatnot, but I feel like this is the best method. Just make sure it doesn't overpool, it'll look really weird if it does, and if you need to add just a little bit more, don't be afraid to. Just always remember the toothpaste analogy. A lot easier to squeeze it out than it is to put it back in. Next, for his loincloth, I didn't get to film this as much as I wished to. You can kind of do whatever you please and it'll look good, but for this, I ended up mixing a little bit of burnt umber and warm brown, and then I just highlight over using a little bit of warm flesh. It creates kind of a natural skin tone-esque loincloth. Personally, I feel like you could do just about anything and it would look really good, but that's what I did for this. Now that our skin tone is finished drying from the wash, we can now add in a little bit of a highlight. This time, however, I'm doing it the more traditional route as I use the shade first. For this, I'm using a little bit of Pallid Witch Flesh. Coming back to the purple, I decided to add in a final highlight using a little bit more white to the ratio of the purple and plum. I'm being a little bit overkill with this, I probably didn't need to do this, I just really like making the purple stand out. If you wish to, and it probably would have looked better if I was a little bit more selective with it, just do this on the tips of the armor, just to add a little bit of a glint. Next for our metallics, mainly the more decorative elements, I'm using some bronze from Pro-Acryl. Hey, I actually remembered it this time. Oh wait, you probably want me to say it again. Bronze. Anyway, I'm just using this on the more decorative elements of the miniature, the little screaming, howling, whatever these are, as well as the more decorative elements of the bolt pistol and the chainsword. Also, I might as well cover it, but I'm also using dark silver on all the more mechanical bits of the miniature. I do this for all the little coils and bits and bobs on every marine I paint. I probably don't even have to add it in, but I might as well just for completionist's sake. Also, just to further the purple a little bit more, I ended up using a little glaze of the darker purple, mainly the dark purple from Pro-Acryl, just to add into some of the raised surfaces that are a little too shaded. This is a good way of just kind of cleaning it up if it's a little too dark for your taste. I'm mainly only applying this to the power pack, just on some of the areas that I think the light would catch it a little bit more. Next, to shade all the metallic bits, I'm using some good old Agrax Earthshade. If you're worried about the silver looking a little dirty from the Agrax, you could use a little Nuln Oil. I just feel like using Agrax over everything is faster and easier. So this next portion is actually kind of weird. I painted this Slaaneshi token on his pauldron using a little mixture of white with some Leviathan purple and Celestium blue. I feel like it gives this really strange effect, like it doesn't look like it really belongs in this universe. And I'd up the ratio of white to these colors for the highlights. I feel like it just kind of gives this weird salt-like rock appeal to it. I just wanted it to generate some weird visual interest. I feel like it kind of plays into the characteristics of Emperor's Children. It doesn't look like it really belongs. It's just kind of weird, and it stands out and it makes you uncomfortable by looking at it. In a good way, hopefully. Hopefully you don't just think it looks ugly. To shade in the symbol, I'd use some contrast medium mixing Celestium blue and Leviathan purple, just so I could put it right into the symbol. For the bronze elements, I'd highlight them using light bronze. And this is pretty self-explanatory. Just make sure to go over all the raised surfaces, and try your best not to paint this into the recesses. For all the silver metallics, I'm using, well, metallic silver from Vallejo Game Color. I just want to highlight the raised surfaces, create some more visual interest. I like the shininess, and it works well for this character. Now, it's not often that I talk about painting bolt pistols or bolt guns. I kind of have my own method for it, but I have to showcase it here because I forgot to show the portion where I painted the straps on the pauldron. I'm using the exact same method. I'm just mixing a little dark gray with ghost gray from Vallejo Game Color, and I'm just painting it onto the raised surfaces, and then I'm going over using a little bit of Black Templar contrast. Coming back to the figure's melon, I decided to do a recess shade using a little bit of Reichland flesh shade. I want this to settle nicely into the recesses. I don't want it to stain too much. I just want it to tan it more so it's more flesh-like. The redness will still remain, but I feel like tying this together as kind of a pseudo-glaze makes it work really well. I then begin re-highlighting using a little bit of dark flesh mixed with some dark ivory. I want to focus this more so on the horns and kind of the crest of the face, just on the sharper details to insinuate that kind of sharp, bone-like structure. Similarly to how knuckles turn white when you squeeze them. I really want to insinuate that the bone structure within this guy's face is really pulling at his flesh. But with that, we are now left with an amazing looking Chaos Marine. I really like this figure. I'm super proud of how it looks. I love the warband overall. I think there's a million ways that you can paint Flawless Host and they'd look amazing. But overall, I think this might be my favorite way. I'm pretty happy with the flames. I think they turned out a little bit better than I was expecting. I definitely want to play around with it more so in other Chaos Marines. Maybe I wouldn't paint them as Flawless Host, maybe use a similar flame design because there's plenty of other Chaos Marine warbands that utilize that. But I've been meaning to paint these guys for a very long time, and it's cool that I got to share it with you guys. But moving on, our next warband is the Cohors Nasicae. These guys are a relatively small warband, but they're run by Lucius the Eternal. Everyone's favorite I win, you lose, overpowered X-Pac go away heat heal that we all love and enjoy. Yeah, we love them a lot, don't we? Okay, you're probably wondering why I'm painting these guys. Well, this scheme is just kind of something I came off the cuff with. It was pretty much entirely improvised. And then I quickly realized after I finished the miniature that, oh wait, I didn't pick out a warband. Does this resemble anything? And these guys are the closest thing to it, so happy birthday. To start this figure, I'm using an M6 Corvus Marine. This is where most of the kit bashing plays into. I basically used a toothpick and the old Slaanesh icon from the old Chaos Marine kit, and I glued it to the top of this Corvus backpack. It's a little messy because I'm using a toothpick, and admittedly I probably should have used something a little bit stronger just in case I dropped this guy, but the toothpick ended up being the exact perfect diameter to fit into the Chaos Marine icon, so I just kinda left it as is. Once I was happy with the placement, I began gluing on the little Noise Marine cannon, as well as the arm. This is where things got a little funky. The shape of the Corvus torso is a little bit different from the typical Chaos Space Marine one, and there's kind of this weird gap between the pauldron and the torso, but it's not entirely noticeable. It's really only noticeable when I blurt it out loud like this. But overall, I find it to be a pretty damn good fit. For his pauldron, I ended up using one from the Raptor set. The Raptor set has a lot of pauldrons with a lot of little speaker-esque designs built into them, so I strongly suggest utilizing that kit when making Emperor's Children figures. Next, for his melon, I decided to use this weird gimp mask from the resin kit. I wasn't quite sure what was supposed to be on his mouth. I actually thought this was excess resin. Apparently it isn't, this is just how it's supposed to look. So I snipped it off and I quickly realized that I kinda messed up major. To alleviate this, I did something a little devious, and I'm really hoping I don't get in trouble for this one. I ended up slicing off a stud from a Corvus pattern pauldron, and yeah, I glued it on, and it's a cool little decorative bead for his mouth, so he doesn't talk. This was kind of difficult to glue on. I ended up using an X-Acto knife to kind of push it into place, and yeah, this was kind of a weird one. This is definitely kind of a weird conversion. I was kind of inspired by Unreal Tournament 2004. A lot of the more creepy designed characters really kind of utilize this kind of art style, and I feel like it fits perfectly with Emperor's Children. That, and for all of you that recognize that I use a lot of Killer 7 music in my videos, I'm gonna make you pog your brains out and just say, oh, it looks like Awazaru. But with that one final detail, I think this guy's ready for painting. To start him out, I began by base coating the entirety of the model after a Zenithal Prime using dark silver. I want to be careful when applying this. I don't want to put this over any of the fleshy areas, nowhere near the face, all that. Also, I don't show it for a while, but I do end up painting the gun using this color. I was a little indecisive, so if you wish to, paint the gun using the dark silver as well. Once the dark silver dried, I dry brush over streakily using a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Silver Metallic. I really want to create these really deep scratches in the armor. I really want to go hog wild with this. And if you wish to, you can use a detail brush to paint in more direct highlights. I ended up doing this mostly on kind of the sharper details like the knees, a little bit on the torso, not too much, not too little. Once that was dry, I'd paint over the entirety of the armor using Leviathan Purple. This is where things get interesting. Once you've coated over the armor, I then dry brush again using a mixture of the silver metallic mixed with the Leviathan purple. Again, I want to create these scratchy highlights. I think it just looks really good on this model. The purple really stands out as a result, and it's just kind of a fun way of doing it. A lot of people utilize airbrushes when it comes to painting on more colored metallics, but this is just so easy to do and it looks amazing. Just make sure it doesn't pool too much. Next, for all the more decorative elements of metallics on the miniature, I'd end up painting them using a little bit of copper from Pro Acryl. I quite like this color. I haven't used it yet, and I'm kind of a big fan of it. Definitely apply 2 thin coats when using this paint. It's not opaque enough for 1 coat. Again, just be careful not to hit any of the fleshy bits on the miniature. It won't be as big a deal as the copper as a much more thin color as compared to the dark silver, but it's just something to look out for. Next, to paint all of the fleshy bits, I'm beginning with some dark warm flesh. I'll be painting this on all the tubes, the gloves, the face, and the little leather strip on the icon. I know traditionally Slaaneshi type Marines have a much more pale complexion. I just wanted to see how a much more traditional tan color would look. You want to be careful applying this over the old resin bits. It's not the end of the world if you mess up and spill over onto the more metallic elements. They're very easy to clean up. It's just nice to not have to worry about cleaning up too much. But again, not the end of the world if you have to. Plus, with the Zenithal Prime, it just glides over. It's so easy to apply, and it's so much fun. We'll then be applying a shade of a little bit of flesh tone from Army Painter mixed with a little bit of red tone. I'm using a very, very tiny bit of red tone. and this mix is primarily being painted onto the flesh that isn't his own. So basically everything besides the little small window we have of his face. For that, you're just using straight up flesh tone. While it's drying, I can add in little highlights using the same flesh tone color, just to kind of re-establish some areas that are a little bit smudged. This portion was a little hard to film. The contrast between the dark purple and the flesh tones made it hard for the camera to capture everything, so it looks a little wonky. But here, I'm just highlighting using a little bit of white tone mixed with the dark flesh, just on the more raised surfaces. If you want to as well, I decided to shade in some of the areas that I felt weren't shaded enough using pure Bugman's Glow. Kind of a cool little trick to do that with. Bugman's Glow is pretty much just a better version of Reikland Flesh Shade in its own right, and you have more control over it, depending on the situation, of course. As you can see here, I'm upping the ratio of dark warm flesh to white, just to mix in some more brighter highlights, mainly on the knuckles and the sharper details of the miniature. Next, to shade the flesh tabard on the little icon, I'm using Carroburg Crimson. This is not really thinned down, it's using just a little bit of Lamian Medium, but I want this to look more fresh. Also, if you wish to, you can splash this around on some of the other flesh tones in the miniature, mostly just some little gaps and tubes, just to add in a little visual flair and interest. Moving back to his face, I decided to paint the mask using a little Vallejo Model Color Black Gloss. Reason I'm using the gloss is I feel like it adds a very latexy finish to it, and even if you blend this color with other colors, it gives that same glossy effect. We want to be really careful when applying this. I do not want to stain any of the flesh using this color, and if you do, it's not the end of the world, but again, I'd rather just finish it in one go. Next, to paint his eyeball, I'm using a little Ghost Gray. I don't know if this is supposed to be an eyeball. I think it's supposed to be like a mark over the eye, or maybe some sort of servo eye, but I thought it would look really gnarly if it was like popping out of his skull. We'll also be using the same color to paint in the other eye. Just be very diligent to let it settle into the recess. We'll then highlight the mask using a little dark gray from Vallejo Model Color mixed with the glossy black. Mixing it together retains the glossiness, and it creates a very effective midtone. After doing so, we'll then move on to shading the miniature, and for this I'm just using Nuln Oil. I'll be applying this over the entirety of the metallics, all over the gun, and anything that isn't resembling flesh. While that dries, you can apply some Carroburg Crimson onto the flesh of the face, and over the eyeball. I'd also incorporate this into some of the other fleshy elements on the miniature. I would just try to be a little bit more sparing with it. I don't want it to be too uniform with the flesh on his face. I feel like it would just look a little bit weird and a little flat. And while that dries, I'd use a little bit of glossy black on the studs of the little flesh tabard. I wasn't sure how I wanted to paint the power cables. At first I was just going to make them black cords, but then I decided to use a little bit of white as I wanted to add in some contrast colors. But before doing that, I'd paint the eyeball and the pupil of the other eye using a little bit of burnt red mixed with black. I then also decided to use a little bit of bold titanium white to paint on some eye shine on the main eyeball. I probably didn't need to do this. I ended up cleaning this up a little bit later on as I felt like it was a little too shiny looking, and I would just use a little bit of gloss varnish to make the shiny effect naturally, but it certainly serves as some good practice. I'd also end up using this color to paint his cool little mouthpiece. We just want to base coat it, and then we'll add in some good contrast colors later on. I'd also apply a nice thin line at the bottom of the tube. It just kind of gives it a natural sharp highlight. And to paint the tubes, I'd use a little bit of Tesseract Glow. I know a lot of people have some gripes with that paint, and I understand why, but I think it looks really good here. The purple and the green just work so well together. Next, to paint his cool mouthguard, I'm using just a little bit of Magmadroth Flame. With the trifecta of the bright green, orange, and the purple, he kinda looks like a weird Halloween decoration. I probably shouldn't have said that out loud. I feel like a lot of people are gonna fail to unsee that. Next, to paint those studs in, I'm using a little bit more silver metallic, and we'd end up dry brushing over the entirety of the metallics using the same color. I might be a little lazy with this. I kind of ended up highlighting the copper using the same color. It looks a little flat, but I think it works for the most part. I then decided to go back in on the flesh tabard, and I'm painting it in using a little bit of blood for the blood god thinned down significantly. Next to paint in his cool mouthguard tangerine, I'm using a little bit of solar flare from Two Thin Coats. And as a final dotting highlight, I'd use a little bit of dark sun yellow. And as one final detail, I decided to paint the leather on the hood using a little bit of Thunderhawk blue on the sharpest edges. And with that, our whatever chapter this is complete. I had a lot of ideas for this miniature. I almost painted this guy as pure gunmetal, but I feel like the purple looks amazing. I'm super happy with this model overall. I feel like all the elements can be very easily applicable to any kind of Emperor's Children or Slaaneshi warband if you wish. As risque and gross as it is, I'm pretty proud of the conversion I made on the face. I'm really hoping I don't get in trouble for that, but shh, don't tell. But moving on to our final miniature, I was originally going to be painting Angels of Ecstasy, and then I quickly forgot that they don't have gold trim, they have black trim. And the pink I painted is a little bit darker than this bright pink that they have displayed in the one piece of imagery that we have of them. But fret not, I'm going to be painting these guys next week, so stay tuned for that. This miniature is kind of an amalgamation of all sorts of Emperor's Children-esque color schemes, similarly to the last one, but it's definitely unique in its own right. And hell, if these guys resemble anything in the lore that I'm not aware of, I'd love to know. Comment down below. Unintentional rhyme. Anyway, to start kitbashing this guy, I'm using a generic Chaos Marine kit. This one is definitely the least converted. I ended up just using the same pieces from the original resin kit, and I think this one fits the best. Again, one problem I ran into is there's kind of an ugly gap between the main armor and the actual resin piece, and for this I ended up using sprue goo. It actually worked a little bit better than I thought it would, but at the end of the day, I feel like maybe using a little bit of plastic putty or some green stuff to fill it in would be better. And the other pauldron I'm using once again is from a Raptors kit. It just works so well for these guys. But the main reason I was so excited to paint this Marine in particular is the headpiece. This is some extreme body horror, and I am all for it. It looks so gnarly, so grimdark, and I really hope that they end up making more faces like this if they end up actually making more official Emperor's Children models. But with the wishful thinking, let's get to the painting. First and foremost, another Zenithal Prime, and for everything metallic, you guessed it, we're using some dark silver. If you want to skip ahead, I totally understand. For all the metallics on the trim, I ended up using more bronze, but this was more integral than the other pieces. I really wanted the bronze to stand out and be kind of a centerpiece of the figure itself. Part of me wanted to just paint this using bronze and white for a portion, but I ended up deciding that I wanted to add in some pink. For this, I used Familiar Pink from Army Painter, and I feel like this color just didn't work as well as I had hoped. Maybe my Zenithal Prime just wasn't bright enough for it to cling onto, but I really feel like it was just a little too thin. Maybe I didn't shake it enough, I don't know. So ultimately, I would still do this portion if you want to speed paint these guys, but I ended up actually painting over this color as it kind of gave me a good outline. Next, I'd paint in over the gloves using some Black Legion. I also painted over some of the tubes, but that's not as interesting visually, you can just use it wherever you please. Also, while the Familiar Pink was drying, I decided to go over all the bronzy areas and clean them up. The color is thin enough that I can just paint over it and it won't make any smudges. But for the next portion of the armor, this is where the paint actually ends up helping me a little bit. See, as much as I wasn't happy with the overall coverage, I felt that it settled really nicely into the recesses, so I decided that I wanted to paint over all the raised surfaces using a little bit of pink horror mixed with Emperor's Children. Again, if you don't want to do this, that's totally understandable. If you want to just use Familiar Pink and just go over twice, that's totally understandable. I know that I'm completely going overboard with painting this. It's a little superfluous, but that's just kind of how I paint. Overall, I don't think the coverage is terribly good on Familiar Pink, but I can't argue that it would make a really good shade. But for now, I really want to establish this bright pink color over all the raised surfaces. Just be sure to really diligently apply it, don't go into any of the recessed details, it'll be a pain in the butt to clean up. Now, this is where I have to mention there's kind of an unfortunate thing that happened with this video. I ended up actually losing part of the footage. All it is one clip, and it's kind of an essential one, but it's pretty easy to follow just by verbiage. All I did was mix familiar pink 1-to-1 with some Lamia medium, and then I'd shade over the entirety of the pink areas. After doing so, as you can see, the pink is much more of a hot pink. Not sure why I said it like that, was a little zesty. But I digress. Going back to the cables, I'm painting them using bold titanium white. I'm actually doing something very similar to the previous model, but I'm going to be going more in depth with the green. It's much more of a concentrated color rather than just Tesseract Glow. Tesseract Glow looks great in my opinion, but I really think this one takes the cake. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Next, I'll be shading all of the metal details using some black wash from Pro-Acryl. I like to mix it up a little bit. If you wanted to use Nuln Oil, that's totally fine. I just had this closer to me. Like with most shades, this is where you can really start seeing this miniature come to life. Applying this to all the little areas and tubes, it just looks so good. Now you probably notice at this point I haven't colored the face at all, and I'm really just going to be relying on that Zenithal Prime. To add in a little bit of color, I'm just using a little bit of Carroburg Crimson. I want this face to look very pale and dead. Dude has a damn jukebox coming out of his face. Now coming back to our pink armor, I decided to highlight the entirety of it using a little bit of Emperor's Children. As you can see, I'm sketching this over all the panel lines. I'm being diligent, but I'm not sweating bullets while doing this. Just focus on some good brush control. If you spill a little bit, work it into the scheme. What I really like about this color is it really makes it stand out overall. It's kind of bold, and it does stand out a lot from the main pink color, and we can work some ways in to really blend it all together to make it look even more interesting. Old Emperor's Children box art has kind of a fleshy pink, and this is definitely more of a almost Barbie doll pink, but in some ways I think this looks even scarier. But as I alluded to with the blending, we're actually going to be taking some glaze medium from Vallejo and mixing it with the Emperor's Children. I'm just going to be dabbling this on the raised surfaces of the main armor. Don't use too much, we don't want this to settle into the recesses, it'll really make the armor look weird if you do so. You just want to carefully feather it in. Once I was done with that, I went back to the tubes and I used some Cairnglass green over the white. I really love this green color, especially over white. In fact, I loved it so much I actually ended up painting more of the tubes with this same color scheme. But coming back to the pink, I decided to feather in just a little bit of Carroburg Crimson mixed with Nuln Oil. As you can probably tell, this is very, very watered down. This is mostly just to tone down a little bit of the glaze I used earlier. I feel like I added a little too much in the shaded areas, and this just kind of helps tone it down. Coming back to the bronze metallics, I'd highlight them using some light bronze, just like we did with the first mini. I also decided to come back in on the pink and just re-establish some of the highlights. Some of it faded a little bit more than I was hoping to, and I just want to re-establish it so it really stands out. Coming back to the melon, I decided to paint on some of the cables using a little bit of Flesh Terror's red. You could use any color you like, it could look cool. Just adding in some neat cables like that is always interesting. Also coming back to the more silver metallic areas on the miniature, I'm using metallic silver from Vallejo Game Color to highlight it. Like I mentioned, the metallics are a little universal. Now coming back to that green glow on his power cables, I'd mix the Cairnglass green with some warm yellow from Pro-Acryl. I kind of up the ratio as I go along the miniature. I want the yellow to be mainly focused on the sharpest details of the tube. And as you can kind of see, my hobby lamp gives us a direct line of where the sharpest highlights should be. We're basically using the green and yellow mixture together to trace over these lines. And if you need to, you could glaze a little bit of Cairnglass green to tie things back together, but something I really want to mention is this color looks a lot brighter while it's wet, and when it dries, it really dulls down. So just try to be patient with it. But as one final detail that I want to mention for the miniature, I decided to use a little bit more Carroburg Crimson, and I'd wash it into the facial structure of the mini, around the tubes and into the eyes, just to create that kind of effect of very irritated flesh. What a wonderful final note for this miniature. And with that, we are complete, and this might be my favorite of the three. It really is ironic. This was my least favorite at first, and as time went on, I grew to really love this mini. I think this color scheme is something I might attempt in the future again. I know I'm terrible about going on and on about how I want to make a kill team, but man, I kind of want to make a kill team out of this scheme. I'll probably want to refine some things. There's definitely parts of this miniature that I think need cleanup, but at the end of the day, I'm really happy with this, and I'm really happy with how the pink and the green stand out together. And yeah, I do feel kind of goofy because the main point of this video is I really did want to paint Angels of Ecstasy, but we'll just save that for part 2. And overall, I think I'm left with some really cool looking minis. I think Slaaneshi colors are really fun to paint with. Pink and purples are something I really don't use all too often, so it really is a treat to finally hunker down and paint some of these schemes. And I hope you found it enjoyable, and most importantly, I hope you found it helpful. If you did, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya!